All right, looks like we've got a good crowd, so let's begin. Mongolia, home of the great Chinggis Khan and a nation of several million people in East Asia today. Why is it important? Who are the people that are there? And where do they come from? That's what I'll aim to answer today in Mongolia, prehistory to Chinggis Khan. To understand any kind of population that's alive today, we have to go back to the last ice age. In the last ice age, you had a lot of Eurasia was covered in glaciers, tundra, and other very inhospitable lands. Mongolia was no exception. And these kind of great glaciers, the climate changes, they definitely shaped a lot of the peoples of northern Eurasia, even if it was just keeping them separate. Back in the last ice age, there were glaciers in Tibet as well as several in Siberia, and this left some peoples isolated. There was a group of people called the ancestral North Eurasians who lived in the region perhaps between Central Asia in the Amu Darya Basin in modern day Uzbekistan and all the way over to what's nowadays Irkutsk, the Yenisei Basin in the Lake Baikal area. We don't have any examples of this Ice Age population from Central Asia, but my guess is most likely that was their kind of center of mass where most of them did live, and we do have evidence of their successor populations into the prehistoric post-Ice Age period, as well as the historical period. Now, the best documented groups are at a place called Infanto Gora and also Malta. Both of those are near the city of Irkutsk in modern Russia. And they contribute quite a bit of ancestry to modern Europeans, and they also play an important role in the formation of the Mongols as well. Now, to the southeast, in in what's called the Amur River Basin, the Amur River that separates China from Russia, we have some prehistoric samples, both from the south in Manchuria and then also from the north in Primorsky Krai in Russia. And some of these samples are called Devil's Cave. There's this cave they found near Vladivostok in Russia, and it has some samples of a group of people who are given the name the ancestral northern Asians, or the ANAs. So we'll be talking about the ancestral northern Eurasians who are in the Baikal area, and also the ancestral northern Asians who are from the Amur River Basin a lot today. I'll call them the ANEs and the ANAs. For the ANEs, there's no group that really exists of them in pure form, but for the ANAs, they're closest to the Nifk people of modern day Far Eastern Russia, and also the Tungusic peoples like the Manchus. So you can imagine kind of a very Asiatic people. Whether or not these specific peoples were directly contributory to the Mongol populations is unknown. They're just used since we have these existing samples, and they work as good proxies for the ancestry of some of the peoples that would be in Mongolia at the time. So at the end of the last ice age, the glaciers, they go and melt, and you start seeing humans migrate to areas that were previously uninhabitable. This is not this also happens in kind of like the Lake Baikal, Mongolia area. Now, Mongolia at the time, it had sort of three separate regions. You have the Far Eastern region, bordering Manchuria. You have the northern region, which shared a lot in common with kind of the greater Lake Baikal area. And then you also have the western region, which is near Jungaria and the Altai Mountains, as well as the Sayan Mountains. And these three regions would all be very distinctive, both in ancestry as well as cultures, for thousands and thousands of years. It wasn't really until the historical era that they became politically united. And now, in the beginning, you have the ancestral Northern Asian people, the ANAs, that kind of rule a lot of Mongolia as well as the Lake Baikal region. And what happens is the ancestral Northern Eurasians, the ANEs, are migrating to the east So you have, over the course of the 4000s, the 3000s, and the 2000s, this kind of group in northern Mongolia and the Baikal region. Actually, the amount of A&E ancestry they have increases about 3 times. So you have these people possibly related to the Botai culture in what's modern-day eastern Kazakhstan, near Lake Balkhash, that are migrating into that area, since presumably Lake Balkhash had a much healthier environment and larger population than Lake Baikal and northern Mongolia, both of which are very, very cold. The region's kind of a forest steppe. It's very flat in some areas and also has quite a bit of trees as well. Meanwhile, in the far east of Mongolia at the time, you have groups that are almost pure ANA in ancestry, and they remain there actually for at least from the earliest sample we have is from 4600 BC, and they pretty much stay pure ANA in ancestry all the way into the Xiongnu period in the few centuries before Christ. So they, very much a lot of racial and cultural continuity there. Or if they were being replaced in eastern Mongolia, then they, were being replaced by very, very similar groups. There's not even really evidence of penetration of agricultural peoples from China at that point. If there were migrations, they were definitely north to south into China, not south to north, which is what we do see later in the historical period. But I'll get there later. So that's kind of these are hunter-gatherer cultures. They're very primitive. They have stone. They don't really leave much of a culture. Before 3500 BC, there's really not much evidence we see for, anything that's really advanced at all. And it's not until the perhaps 3300 BC that we really start to see things change. So the first site we have is from about 3150 BC, and we start to see evidence of domestic livestock, sheep, goats, and cattle in Mongolia, as well as stone mounds. There's these circular flat stone structures with upright stones, and the burials in them have their legs flexed in an internal pit. They also contain some metal artifacts, usually arsenical bronze, which is kind of a not great form of bronze. You're using arsenic rather than tin mixing with copper. So not the greatest metal workers, but still far more advanced than anything that was in Mongolia at the time. And this culture is called the Akanavo culture. And the Akanavo culture is very interesting because it has similarities with the Yamnaya culture, which is thousands and thousands of miles to the west in southern Russia. Modern-day Kalmykia, modern-day Samara, Volgograd, that whole area. So thousands and thousands of miles to the west, and you have these people with identical burial customs, and as it turns out, they are genetically identical. There's no real difference in ancestry between the Akanavo culture and the Yamnaya culture. And there's actually links with them even about 200 years later in Europe too. So what it looks like is there was some sort of great steppe empire. The steppe is this very flat land that goes all the way from southern Romania up into Moldova, through Ukraine, southern Russia, northern Kazakhstan, and all the way into Mongolia, even if there are some minor interruptions here and there. So it looks like there was this great steppe empire that kind of developed in the very late 4th millennium BC. Or at the very least, it was kind of roving pastoralists that settled in very, very far away areas. Now, what had happened was the Indo-European people, that is the Indo-European languages are the languages spoken by the Yamnaya and their descendants, had developed things like carts, metals, and that enabled them to spread. They had a tremendous advantage in mobility over their hunter-gatherer neighbors. Now, the Akanavo culture is interesting as well. The Indo-Europeans were notorious for destroying a lot of their enemies to the east, to the north, to the west, and to the south. It doesn't look like that happened in Mongolia. It actually did not happen. The locals, the local ANA people, and the who were mixed with the ANE people, actually adopted a lot of the Akanavo culture's tools, their techniques. By the time you get to 2500 BC, the people living in Akanavo Culture sites are only maybe 10% Indo-European in ancestry. They're overwhelmingly the ancestral North Eurasian and ancestral Northern Asian mix. So what had happened was the locals were actually quite clever and they weren't destroyed. They instead adopted a lot of the beneficial cultural practices. You start to see animal herding. It's from historical records, we know that the Mongols would drink this fermented mare's mix. It looks like that was practiced as far back as the third millennium as well, um, because at the time the peoples of Mongolia, and I'm not going to call them Mongols since they were not at that point, um, that's how they processed the milk. The Indo-Europeans at that time, they largely could not drink milk either, so it's likely they were doing something similar as well. So that's very interesting. Another thing that's worth noting too is that the Altai and Sayan Mountains to the west of Mongolia actually have large tin deposits, which would become very important in the next 1,000 years. When you mix tin with copper, you get a much higher quality bronze than if you're using arsenic. And this would later play a major role in the Ehrlich expansion, which we'll be discussing next week. And this undoubtedly played a role in the history of the Mongols as well. Now, succeeding the Mongol, or the Akanavo culture, the Indo-Europeans, you have this people called the Joharians that appear in the historical period, people such as the Kuchians, who are referenced in, we actually have their language as well as some other records. They were a very Indian, very Hindu and Buddhist influenced group that lived in modern day Xinjiang and the Tibetan Basin in western China. And they're known for being very distinctive. They're referred to as having Caucasian features. It's doubtful that they were, white as we would have understood them, but, they would have had some features that would have looked very unique for that area. And they're well known for having being very involved in the spread of Buddhism to China in the classical period. Some of their ancestry still survives in the Uyghur people, but it's very possible that this Akanavo culture was actually, at least in part, the ancestors of these Tocharian peoples. And the Tocharian languages are actually, and it's not a coincidence, known to have split from the other Indo-European languages around 3300 BC, which is exactly what we'd expect given the time that the Akanavo culture split off. So the Akanavo culture was not the only Indo-European group to spread into Mongolia in the early Bronze Age. You have the Chemerchek culture. The Chemerchek culture looks like it was a more mixed Indo-European group, possibly from a group of Indo-Europeans who had mixed with the Botai culture of Central Asia. And they went and spread into also Western Mongolia, kind of overlapping in the Akanavo culture period. They similarly buried their dead in these tombs with their legs flexed. And they also had things like shepherd's crooks that they would bury, stone bowls, bone tools, ceramics, sometimes metal jewelry. It's possible they practiced animal sacrifice, but we definitely know that they used ruminant dairy products and also had, similar farm animals, like goats, cattle, that sort of thing, that we see with the Akanavo culture as well. So, it's from what it looks like, these early Indo-European groups that spread to the east, they weren't as violent, were more tolerant, or, they entered in some sort of lord-subject relationship with their more primitive neighbors, and their neighbors eventually either absorbed them due to their superior numbers or adopted their technology and overthrew them. It's difficult to say since we unfortunately don't have any records for this period. So, succeeding this, we have, we start to see climate change. Or actually, let me go back. So, another group that looks like it was partially derived from the Indo-Europeans is the Akanavo culture in the Minneshusk Basin. And they're kind of interesting. The group looks like it's sort of an even mix between the ANA people as well as the ANE people. So, and they're a bit further west than Mongolia, but I'll still include them in this talk. Um, and I think for whatever reason, I think we have going in the prehistoric period in the from perhaps 12,000 BC all the way through 3000 BC, you have these migrations of these A&E rich peoples that keep on gradually spreading further and further to the east. For whatever reason, it's possible that Central Asia was just more technologically developed. Maybe it was um, you just have a larger population and they keep on spreading to the east. But you don't really see kind of the spread from east to west until you get into the historical period. It's all very much west to east for kind of that 8,000 year period from 12,000 BC all the way into 4,000 BC, at least as far as the ancestral northern Eurasians are concerned. You could also argue, of course, that it's just the Central Asians are pushing both east and west at the same time, since you have the Eastern hunter-gatherers who comprise a large amount of the Indo-European ancestry that eventually push into Europe in the Indo-European conquests that we discussed last week. So prehistoric Central Asia is very, very interesting. I think it plays a very key role in understanding a lot of prehistoric Eurasia, both in the east, as far as east as Mongolia, as well as in the west with the formation of the Indo-European peoples, and also some of the interesting trade links that we see between the Middle East and the Caucasus, as well as Central Asia in the prehistoric period. That's where we get the Akanavo culture. They're this mix of the Afanasyevo people, the Indo-Europeans, and very similar to how the Afanasyevo and the Chemerchek people were absorbed by the locals that they settled near. And the Akanavo culture, very similar, very little, small amount of Indo-European ancestry, and largely, mostly genetic continuity. And you also see the adoption of a lot of those kind of pastoral practices with farm animals. Now, using farm animals is a tremendous advantage over the previous kind of agricultural, or not agricultural, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle they had. There's an excellent book. It's called The Urals and the Bronze and Iron Ages by Lyudmila Kuryakova and Andrei Epimachov. And they argue that a lot of these kind of pastoral peoples of northern Eurasia would have between 8 and 20 farm animals, and that would actually be enough to sustain their family, as well as what they would get in hunting and gathering. So this would have contributed to a population boom. They would have been able to feed a lot more kids and have much larger populations than they had previously. So it definitely advanced the society of these peoples of kind of Mongolia and Siberia tremendously. And that's why you start to see a lot more social complexity with more burials, more elaborate cultures, and increasingly long distance trade routes as well. So that is the Chemercheks and the Afanasyevo. Now, in the second millennium, we see there's a lot of different things going on. You start to see this Intashta culture, which is an Indo-European group far to the west, kind of in the southern Urals, kind of South Siberia, Kazakhstan area, as well as parts of kind of Eastern European Russia. And they go and they're developing the chariots, and a lot of this might have to do with the expansion of the grasslands. There is a climate change within the second millennium where the grasslands expand. In Mongolia, this is associated with the massive expansion of horse use and horse milking. Like we were talking about, the kind of fermented mare's milk. That's looks like that was when it really massively expanded in the second millennium BC. The Santashta people likely spoke almost certainly actually spoke Indo-Iranian languages, and quite a few of them actually migrated all the way to Mongolia. They played a very major role in Western Mongolia as the Deerstone culture, and there's also the Baitag culture, which was maybe 30 to 40% Santashta in ancestry from, I believe we have 2 samples of them. And they're mixing with their, predecessors from kind of the Baikal and, or who I should say are best modeled by the Baikal and Hosfagol people. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. The Deerstone people do show a lot of heterogeneity. Um, there's some Deerstone people that have a lot more, are almost pure ANA ancestry. And, so these were definitely like heterogeneous groups for sure, at least from the evidence that we have for them today. A lot of this, it's possible. We know from other genetic studies, like in Ireland, that even very, very primitive hunter-gatherer tribes with populations of a few thousand were extremely well aware of kinship. It's possible they practiced kind of like long-distance bride exchanges to avoid inbreeding. To my knowledge, there's not really any evidence of inbreeding within any of these groups that we're discussing today. So that would be my personal guess for what's going on and why we have, some intra-cultural heterogeneity going on. Interestingly, into the second millennium BC, I mentioned kind of the Akanavo culture people had, largely been absorbed by their neighbors. There's actually some groups as late as 1500 who have a lot more of that kind of Tuturian, Yamnaya, Afanasyevo ancestry than would be expected. A lot of the other Indo-European groups at the time, actually pretty much all of them, would have had a lot of Eastern European farmer ancestry, and they're modeled as the Cordware people, the Santashta people, whatever you want to call them. This guy actually does not, or gal, I can't remember. He or she does not have that Santashta ancestry. Instead, it's with some groups in Central Asia. So it's kind of a strange mix, but it looks like that was possibly one of the groups that later became the Tuturian people. So there's still some hanging out in Mongolia as late as 1500 BC. Now, within the second millennium BC, you have a few other cultures. You have the Deerstone culture, which is kind of, that mix of the ANA people, the ANE people, with some Indo-European ancestry. And, they go and actually largely get replaced by the Ulanzuk culture. The Ulanzuks are, those kind of pure ANA people from eastern Mongolia. And they go and they spread within kind of the Iron Age period, maybe 1200 to 900 BC, into northern Mongolia and into kind of the Lake Baikal area. And they largely displaced the Deerstone people. Now, the Deerstone people aren't totally wiped out. We do see samples with their ancestry as late as the Hyongnu period. So it looks like they were kind of pushed to more marginal lands, reduced in their importance. So they weren't destroyed in totality. And the other thing that happens in Western Mongolia, which actually plays a major role, is you have the expansion of the Saka people. Now, the Saka are an Iranian-speaking group that played a very major role, all over Central Asia and into Mongolia as well. They're nomadic horse riders, very much kind of the Scythian, Sarmatian, those type of Iranian peoples that would play a big role into the historical period and are noted by the Romans. So, as we get into the historical period, we have kind of these major groups. We have the Sakas in the west. We have the ANA people, in the east. We have, the ANA peoples also in the north, and then you have the Hyongnu who come around, and the Hyongnu are actually testified to in historical records fairly extensively. It's possible Hyongnu is related to Hun, the famous Huns who invaded the Roman Empire in the historical period. The Hyongnu were, looks like they were the first ones to unite Mongolia. They rose kind of in the second half of the first millennium BC. And they were extremely powerful. They bring people all the way from the western steppe as well as the eastern steppe, and they're kind of mixing them all around. The Xiongnu themselves were possibly Yanisian speakers. The Yanisians, uh, one of the languages that survives is the Ket language on the Yenisei River basin. It was most likely a lot more widespread. There's evidence it used to cover a lot of eastern Eurasia, and there also was a spread of the Yanisian languages into North America as well, where it later became the Navajo and Apache languages as well as Athabascan, and it looks like there were also kind of a naval expansion along the California coast too. But that's for another topic. Um, anyhow, you know the Xiongnu were extremely diverse. They mixed together all these peoples from all over Siberia, from Mongolia, from Central Asia together, and you get all sorts of interesting mixes. And eventually, they fought all these terrible, terrible wars with the Chinese. The Chinese spent a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of blood in destroying them, and eventually managed to kind of play a divide and conquer, where they set two Xiongnu groups against each other, and eventually they collapsed around 100 AD. Now, this collapse was just absolutely enormous. Um, you see some like pure Iranian groups, probably Saka or Sarmatians, as well as pure ANA groups, who are probably Turks or the original Uyghurs, not the Uyghurs as we know them. Um, there's evidence of human sacrifice in this period as well. So it's very, very bleak period. Um, since there wasn't any set group that was controlling everything, you do see kind of these uncontrolled raids into China. It looks like they were kidnapping a lot of Chinese people and enslaving them and treating them very, very poorly. Although, of course, some of them, they married well, so it wasn't all bleak. There is one poem written by a Chinese writer from this period, which is supposed to be from a Chinese princess, and it's kind of lamenting that she has to leave her people and go and live with these savage steppe peoples. So it probably was not fun for her, growing up in palace luxury and then going to live in the steppe. Interestingly, even though it was probably terrible for, someone who's like a princess to go and join the steppe peoples, it would have likely not have been that bad for, your average Chinese peasant. If you're just stuck, living under some lord who taxes you a lot, and you can leave that life and go on to be a free riding horseman, live off your herd of farm animals, go raiding every once in a while. They were definitely a lot healthier, stronger, less disease ridden than a lot of the Chinese peasants at the time. So you actually do see this kind of uptick in Chinese ancestry in the historical period. And my guess is it's probably from these Chinese renegades. You see similar stuff, in the colonization of the Americas, for instance, where you have, kind of the constant stream of white renegades that are getting sick and tired of living under the agricultural governments of the U.S. states, and they'll go and join off the Indian tribes where they can be much more free and live off farm animals and hunting. Um, so I think it was very, very similar. And those turncoats, of course, caused a lot of problems for the Chinese. The successor groups, one of the most famous ones is the Uyghurs. Despite the name, they're actually not that close. They're actually not related to the Uyghurs as we know them. They were extremely heterogeneous at least for the samples we have in the 6th century AD. Some of them are as much half Iranian in ancestry, and some of them are almost pure ANA. So they were definitely including a lot of different groups in their, society. The Khitan people, Khitan, they were almost entirely East Asian in ancestry. However, they do, at least for the model they use, they include a lot of Han ancestry, Han Chinese, that is. It's uncertain if, that was kind of a prehistoric Han splinter group or if it was more recent mixing. I think it was more recent mixing from those kind of documented, Chinese renegades that are running away. Now, by the time we get to the early Middle Ages, kind of the early second millennium AD, the peoples of Mongolia are better mixed they're on average maybe 15% Iranian in ancestry, and by Iranian I'm talking about kind of the Iranian steppe peoples, not the Iranians from modern Iran. They're about 60% ANA in ancestry and about 25% Chinese in ancestry. The groups we talked about earlier, it looks like pretty much all this ancestry is from the groups that were brought there in the Xiongnu period. The groups we discussed earlier that had kind of the more ancestral North Eurasian mix from around Lake Baikal, they're gone. The group, kind of like the Proto-Tocharian people, they're all gone as well. They'd either fled or were wiped out. There are some signs from some Siberian groups all the way in Chukdo-Kamachka that, some of those were descendants from, people who fled the collapse of the Xiongnu. So the collapse of the Xiongnu was a big deal. It sent peoples, all the way over, everywhere in Eurasia. And I think the Huns were probably one of those groups. Another group, one of these successor groups to the Xiongnu was called the Rouran people. And again, this is the kind of late antiquity, early Middle Ages, the 600s, 700s, or I think the 500s. And the Rouran people, they ruled Mongolia. And interestingly, they've tested the genetics of the Avar people. The Avar people invaded Europe, I believe, in the 500s or 600s, and caused all this terror. They raided the suburbs of Constantinople, and eventually were destroyed by the Frankish kingdom, around Charlemagne's time, before the Hungarians came in, and they lived in kind of modern-day Hungary area. They were actually the descendants of the Rouran people, and it looks like in some cases they kept themselves apart from their neighbors for almost 100 years. They preferred to marry women all the way from the east, so they had some very, very long, communication lines where they kept in touch with their, neighbor, old friends and relatives back home. So that's kind of similar to what we see in Genghis Khan's time, 500 or 600 years later. The Avars were probably Mongol speakers, and they would have been the first Mongol invaders of Europe, not Genghis Khan and his descendants and the hordes that invaded in the 13th century. So going back to Genghis Khan, so there's not that much that needs to be said about him. He was very destructive. It's believed that his Y chromosomal haplogroup is C2b, and about 1/3 of all Mongols have it. So he was, him and his sons were very, very successful. And there's tens, hundreds of millions of people that are direct male line descendants of him. Interestingly, the kind of what we see from the Xiongnu afterwards is the reversal of that kind of Western Eurasian to Eastern Eurasian migrations, and you start to see the Eastern Eurasian peoples migrating to the West. There's a couple different explanations for this. One of them is that Mongolia has kind of a variable climate. You would have several good years where people would be able to build up their stocks of livestock, and eventually you'd have a bad year when there was a famine, there wasn't enough grass, all the animals were starving, and this would cause a tribe or tribes to fight amongst each other, and the losing tribes would flee Mongolia and have to go and invade, the west, the east, the north, wherever they could go to find more pasture lands. So that's one theory. Another theory is that it was simple closeness to the Chinese. The Chinese were, the most powerful country in the world, really up until, other than some brief periods until probably about 1820 to 1840. And, the closeness to the Chinese and their military expeditions would force these tribes to, flee in exile to the west. So that's another explanation. We definitely see probably around 1800 to 1500 BC technological advancement definitely shifts eastwards, as far as the most advanced societies go. The most advanced metals were produced, out of copper and tin from the Sian and Altai Mountains, kind of in the Middle Bronze Age, and that's linked with the expansion of the Uralic peoples. So going, the legacy of this kind of shift from West Eurasia to East Eurasia being the center of technological development, of it being the source of migrants, we do see kind of the end of a lot of the Iranian peoples of Central Asia. So the descendants of the Santashta peoples, the all these other groups that are in Central Asia, they're eventually very much pushed to the periphery. Um, the last remnants are kind of the Tajiks who are hanging out. Modern day Tajikistan, but all the other states of Central Asia are, you have the Kazakhs who are Turks, you have the Mongols who are Mongols, you have, the Tuvans who are also Turkic peoples, even if they have a lot of Mongol influences. You have the Uzbeks who are Turkic speakers. The Turkmens are also Turkic speakers. So you have all these Turkic speakers who, descend at least in part and much more heavily in the male line from these kind of Eastern Eurasian migrants than their Iranian predecessors. Even though the Iranians, I should emphasize, do still contribute a lot of ancestries to the peoples of modern day Central Asia. I believe one study I read said that the average Uzbek is about two-thirds of the kind of, pre Turkic invasion Iranian in ancestry. So, kind of the settled peoples, they still do have a lot of descendants. The average Uyghur today is maybe like half Toharian and half, Turkic in ancestry as well. So, I know this talk was a little bit